The Auditor General admitted today government departments need to make some drastic improvements. State-owned enterprises are also at risk. Some may struggle to continue operating. Let's get more insight from the report from the Auditor General Kimi Makwetu, who joins us in our studio from Cape Town. Thank you very much for your time. Good evening. Welcome to Newsnight. Today you were telling us how 1.2 trillion rand effectively of public money was spent. Irregular expenditure staggeringly increasing by 80%. How much of this is attributable to just plain poor accounting, and how much money actually has just been lost or stolen?
You know, thanks very much, Mani. When you look at irregular expenditure, the bulk of that money is already accounted for. What we are flagging here is the risk associated with not performing according to the prescribed regulations for supply chain. So some of it is genuinely accounted for, as I say, but one doesn't know whether you bought the stuff at the price that is affordable to government, as well as at a price that is reasonable for the type of goods that you bought.
Is this the scenario that applies when it comes to
PRASA? And so if you look at this 46...
I beg your pardon? Sorry. Okay,
I was going to say that if you look at that whole amount... Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, sir.
I was going to say that if you look at that whole amount, there's no doubt a huge contribution to it by the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, to the extent of about 13 billion of it is attributable to PRASA. And these are transactions in the past that never surfaced when the audit was done. And after the investigation was instituted by the accounting authority at PRASA, those matters started coming to the surface. And I think one of the key messages that we are highlighting also is that if the board is not active in pursuing proper oversight over these matters, some of them could be hidden in the system because the audit is based on a sample of transactions. However, the board has got a full picture about the entirety of the institution.
Well, what censure can be applied, Mr. Makwetu, to entities like PRASA? And we'll talk about SOEs in general just now and the oversight that the minister must exercise. But when you look at PRASA in particular, Dr. Popo Molefe, the chair of PRASA, filed this explosive affidavit towards the end of August, where he said 80 million rand of PRASA's deal with the shell company Swifambo Train Leasing was, for example, ended up in ANC pockets and so on. Aside from just the numbers in your report, I mean, should we be seeing, higher levels of accountability on money that perhaps has not been spent correctly?
Directionally, if you look at what a board should do, it ought to do what has been put in place already by PRASA, where when irregular expenditure is highlighted through the audits, it must not be something that's ignored as if it was just a cosmetic matter that needed to be addressed. I think the issue that we are insisting on in the report is that instances of irregular expenditure, when they do not get investigated, they remain like that in the institution, and that's why you find every year we tend to report about the same issues, the same numbers in the same institutions. It's only when the leadership at the level of the board, together with executive management, start taking steps to investigate, get to the bottom of these issues, so that they can isolate what has happened as a result of incompetent execution of work versus deliberate intent to divert resources. We can never establish that to the T in an audit, because an audit is not an investigation. It's a process that identifies the gap between what was expected and what was done.
On the issue of state-owned enterprises, are you expecting that, given the scenario you've just painted, that the Public Enterprises Minister must really get on board and take the lead that has been given to her through your report? I mean, you have spoken about your concern today about the financial future of state-owned enterprises in South Africa. By the way, it was a red flag that was also raised by Pravin Gordhan during his medium-term budget. It's also an issue that was raised in the Public Protector's report. Should the Minister of Public Enterprises really be held accountable in some way or responsible for taking these matters into hand?
If you look at it, it goes much broader than that. There are a specific number of entities that are potentially supervised under the Department of Public Enterprises. The Ministry of Energy has also got certain state-owned entities that operate under their care. So does communication, if you look at the likes of Centec, the likes of SABC. So the reality is that all of these ministries that have got public entities need to start gearing up their governance implementation, as well as providing support to the boards who are assigned to specifically perform this task. And if you look at some of the pronouncements and the principles that have been elevated in the recent launch of the King 4, it speaks to some of these fundamentals in terms of what needs to be done. So I agree that these entities, if they don't address the issue of instability of leadership, both at an executive level as well as those that are in the accounting authority, if that is not addressed and they continuously operate without strong leadership on the ground, the reality is that the financial fortunes of these entities also go the opposite direction. Before we know it, many of them may end up riding into the sunset.
You put it quite eloquently, and some might say diplomatically there, Mr. Makwetu, but are we really at the danger point now? Not to be alarmist, but bearing in mind, and you do the, the cold, hard sums and the calculations around the state of health and the state of our finances, across the public sector. Are we in dangerous territory right now?
Well, it goes without saying, if you listen to what the Minister of Finance pronounced when he spoke at the medium-term budget policy statement, where he said where there's no growth, there's no possibility for revenue to be generated, and hence the limit for additional expenditures to be incurred. So if those expenditures that have already been allocated are being spent in ways that are not geared towards achieving the objectives for which they were allocated, the reality is that that is no doubt a dangerous situation to be.
So lament we can, but in terms of an operational response to everything that you've highlighted, and we heard from the Wits School of Governance a little bit earlier on, we're basically making the suggestion that perhaps some of these accounting systems and the processes are overly complexified, overly complicated. Are you calling for a simplification in the way procurement is happening so that we can keep track of these things in a much more fluid and transparent way?
The fundamental issue, I think, Iman, is that if you are pronouncing a strategy that is against corruption, the starting point is to act against it. Accounting systems are a tool to provide a mechanism to collect information so that you can provide an opportunity for people who are supposed to act. So my view is that you can invest all the money that there is on systems to try and get people to do all manner of analysis and spreadsheet. The bottom line is that if those that are charged with acting do not act, the situation will not change.
Are you keeping a close watch on what's happening at Eskom?
To the extent that I read about Eskom currently, insofar as the audit function is concerned, that is handled by an external party, an outside audit firm. But certainly as a public auditor, we are interested in all of the entities that are largely funded out of the National Revenue Fund. So certainly we do. The level of involvement there is potentially to follow what is going on with regards to issues of governance. We do not directly audit, but certainly where public funds flow to any entity, we ought to be interested in them as required by the Public Audit Act.
Final one, do red flags then come up when you consider developments in the Together deal, for example?
Come again?
Do red flags come up when you consider developments in the Together deal, for example?
Pretty much, I guess, if you look at what has been described around that transaction, it's got a litany of red flags. And I think the issue is that when those red flags do not get confronted and dealt with, they tend to continue and perpetuate themselves into the future. So our job, quite frankly, is around identifying what these red flags are, bring them to the attention of those that are charged with governance as the laws of the land require. And unfortunately, we do not have the power to insist that they must. Possibly ours is potentially towards the area of persuasion.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us and for your time this evening. Appreciate it. Auditor General Kimi Makwetu joining us from our Cape Town studio.